This video is about the use of logic and a little psychology to reveal the possible underlying origin for the biblical story of the Exodus. Because of the significance of the Exodus story, an enormous amount of research has been done and many theories have been developed to support the reality or at least the origin of the story. Many of these theories are very complex, well-researched, and highly detailed. However, none of these theories are universally accepted. In fact, most academically based researchers agree that no archaeological evidence has so far been discovered that proves any part of the Exodus story. Of course, many people seek to understand the Exodus based on biblical scriptures. A scriptural analysis typically tries to understand the Exodus by assuming that all of the scriptures are true. In contrast, what I attempt to do in this video is take only a few scriptures that might have some sort of factual basis and apply a logical analysis to them. Of course, if you believe that the Bible is to be taken literally, then you will completely reject my method and the resulting theory. You may, however, still want to watch the video merely to see how logic can be used to produce a reasonable and hopefully interesting theory. First, let me clarify the type of logic that I will be using in this video. One type of logical process can be called objective logic. This is a system where all of the facts and variables are known. This typically leads to one inevitable correct answer or conclusion. Instead, I will be using what I call subjective logic. This is a system in which not all of the variables are known and/or personal preferences are part of the process. One of my reasons for doing this video is rooted in the realization that highly significant stories often have some element of truth to them. For the starting point of my analysis, I have selected two main scriptures. The first is the scripture about the number of people in the Exodus itself. The Bible speaks of 603,550 individuals, and they were all of fighting age. When women, children, and old men are included, then the population of the Exodus would have exceeded perhaps 2 million people or even more. This many people seems to be a problem. For example, when Jacob originally came to Egypt, there were only 70 individuals in his family. So over a period of between 215 and 430 years, there's some disagreement as to how long a period of time actually took place, it's just hard to believe that the Israelite population grew to a couple of million people. The original Hebrew version of the scripture uses the word which is spelled E-L-E-P-H. This is usually translated as the number 1,000. However, an alternative translation is also available, and it's the word family, not the number 1,000. So instead of 600,000 plus people, we have 600 families, which would be something like 5 to maybe 10,000 people in total. So, we can still accept the scripture as being correct and logical if it is reinterpreted and the Exodus is now composed of about 600 families. The second scripture chosen for analysis is the assertion that the Israelites wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Now, 40 years doesn't seem logical because Canaan isn't that far away from Egypt. In fact, you could get to Canaan in just about 40 days. So it's logical to at least explore the possibility that the Exodus took 40 days and not 40 years. In support of this interpretation, consider the following. First, Scripture confirms that at least some of the Israelites were aware that there was an established route to a prosperous and nearby land called Canaan. This trade route was called the Way of Horus, or the way to the land of the Philistines. Secondly, the most logical place to go after leaving Egypt was the closest place where there was food and water, and not enter into a largely unknown desert region. Thirdly, the Way of Horus was a very easy route. From Egypt to Beersheba, it's only about 197 miles, with an elevation gain of only 2,200 feet. In contrast, if the traditional Exodus route from Egypt to Mount Nebo was followed, without any wanderings in the desert, the direct route would have been about 553 miles, with a total elevation gain of over 17,000 feet. Here is another map, developed by biblical scholars, that highlights at least a part of the Way of Horus as one of the possible Exodus routes. But what are we to make of the Bible specifically saying that the Exodus did not take this route? The reason given in Scripture is that in going that way, they might be faced with war. However, this doesn't seem to be a logical excuse, because any direction they went would likely lead to conflict with the people whose land they would be entering. At this point, we turn to psychology for an explanation. The underlying meaning of the Scripture may be similar to this famous line from Shakespeare. This quote represents a psychological process that is often present when deception occurs. This psychological process is called a reaction formation. It refers to someone whose vehement denials are an attempt to convince others of something for which the exact opposite is true. Now, if this was an intentional deception, why would the authors of Exodus have done this? Perhaps they did it because it's like Homer's famous stories about the glory of the ancient Greeks. If the Exodus story was going to be a really big saga with an enormous amount of drama, suffering, atonement, heroic acts, etc., you need a long and difficult journey for the story to develop its significance and power. A short journey down the Way of Horus would have been just too easy to become an epic story. The next three maps are based on Google Earth estimates of how long it would take to walk from Egypt to Canaan. This first map shows that according to Google Earth, it would take 182 hours to follow the traditional route from Egypt to Mount Nebo. To make it in 40 days, with 1 day a week of rest, the Israelites would have had to walk 5.4 hours a day. Since this traditional route of the Exodus usually didn't follow any established caravan routes, and it went through very rough and mountainous areas, the modern Google Earth estimate of only 182 hours is likely to be highly underestimated. In any case, it's unreasonable to assume that the journey along the traditional route could have been completed in anywhere near 40 days. Because of current border restrictions along the Egyptian-Israeli border, Google Maps won't show the most direct route from Egypt to what is now the heartland of Israel. Therefore, the route has to be broken up into two maps. The combined length of time from the two maps is just a little more than 64 walking hours. And to walk 64 hours in 40 days, the Israelites would have had to walk only about 2 hours a day, 6 days a week. So, if we are to reconcile the shorter route along the Way of Horus with the 40 years mentioned in Scripture, all we have to do is change the 40 years to 40 days. Then it makes sense. If the Exodus route followed the most logical direct route to Canaan along the Way of Horus, then the parting of the sea is the only major event in the traditional Exodus story that would fit. So let's assume that the parting of the sea, at least in some form, actually occurred. This map shows 3 of the many theorized crossing points. 2 of these sites are consistent with the route along the Way of Horus. This map shows a close-up of one of the areas where the crossing through the parted sea may have occurred. This diagram is from the area of the Nile Delta close to the Way of Horus. It summarizes a very detailed scientific theory on how the parting of the seas could have actually happened as the result of natural causes. So what about the other major events in the Exodus story? Either the other events have to be regarded as mere inventions to advance a particular narrative, or the Israelites may have made a detour that led to an area where at least a few additional biblical events may have actually occurred. If a detour did happen, the most logical place for it to occur would have been at the Wadi el-Arish. There are at least two reasons for a detour at this point. The first is that Scripture identifies this wadi, or a riverbed, as part of the boundary God established for the Promised Land. Secondly, at the time of the Exodus, there just may have been water flowing in this riverbed, and following a river would be tempting because it guarantees a source of fresh water for travelers. If you haven't already noticed, it's the green line in this diagram that shows the possible detour route. This map shows several possible paths the Israelites may have taken after taking a detour at the wadi. Some of these routes, especially the one in green, which avoids most of the mountains and leads to Beersheba, could also have been completed in about 40 days. The hiking hours per day along this path would have only been about 3 hours per day, and this route would have been the most logical because it was the easiest. God, Moses, and the Ten Commandments are all inevitably linked to Mount Sinai, and the real Mount Sinai, as well as other Exodus sites, may be along the route of this detour. Traditionally, Mount Sinai is located in the southern mountains of the Sinai Peninsula. However, there have been many sites proposed for Mount Sinai. In any case, no archaeological evidence has ever been found to positively locate the site of Moses' Mount Sinai. In terms of ease of access, and at least one explorer, this mountain here may be the most logical site for Mount Sinai. From the Way of Horus, it is only a 32-mile detour down the wadi. 118 miles from the Way of Horus and down the wadi is another mountain site that has been extensively researched and has been proposed as the site of Moses' Mount Sinai. In conclusion, let me review the basic principles of this video. The video presents a theory based on a few selected scriptures and certain logical assumptions. These scriptures and assumptions are supported by some circumstantial evidence. As such, it is hopefully an interesting theory, but there is no claim that there is sufficient evidence to actually prove it.